Hello, it is Brett. I'm here to talk about cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So this is module 7, and we have a nice little picture of a hummingbird sucking on some nectar from a fake flower. Um, but they eat from real flowers too. So why are they doing this? Because they need energy. And how do the flowers make sugar? How do they make the nectar? These are all questions that we will get to in this module. All right, so the big ideas for this module, we want to think about maybe the big picture of metabolism and how do cells meet their energy demands. We'll talk about ATP and some other energy-carrying molecules, and we'll look at the links between photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Then we'll take a slightly closer look at glucose catabolism, that is the breakdown of glucose, looking at some pathways and how it fits into the context of other types of metabolism. And then we'll also take a slightly closer look at photosynthesis. But I am going to try and skip as much of the biochemical detail as I possibly can and still get the main ideas across. So we'll see how well I do with that. All right, so just to remind you that the two types of chemical reactions, the ones where energy comes in, and so the products have more energy than the reactants, those would be endergonic reactions. And the opposite, where the reactants have more energy and the products have less and energy comes out, that's an exergonic reaction. The big question is, if enzymes are catalyzing most of a cell's metabolism, enzymes can't create energy out of nothing because thermodynamics, where is that energy coming from to supply these endergonic reactions? And the answer is that cells have to couple an exergonic reaction with an endergonic reaction to get things to run. And the exergonic reaction that cells really, really like to use is the breakdown of ATP. Well, what is ATP? ATP is just an energy-carrying molecule. You could think of this as like a rechargeable battery that the cell can use to do a specific task, and then that battery can go get recharged somehow. If we look at the chemical structure of ATP, it's basically a nucleotide of RNA that has been modified with a few extra phosphates. And in particular, this last phosphate group, there's a high energy bond between the second and third phosphates. And so by splitting off that third phosphate, that energy can be released. So this is a cell's, kind of main source of short-term energy. There are some other energy-carrying molecules that we don't need to get into here. But there are some electron-carrying molecules, or electron shuttles, as I like to think of these. And these are molecules like NAD+, FAD, and NADP. And we'll see those later on. So, all right. So how do these coupled reactions work? Well, basically, the energy from the breakdown of our food molecules that can power the exergonic reaction of, the exergonic reaction that is breaking down glucose and other food molecules, that can power the endergonic reaction of building an ATP molecule. So from ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, so it's only got 2 phosphate groups. And if we tack that third phosphate group on, that takes some energy. So we have to couple that to a breakdown reaction or find another energy source. Thanks, plants. Just doing some foreshadowing. And then we can use the breakdown of ATP, because that's an exergonic reaction. We can use that to do to produce energy or to release energy for cellular work. So, yeah. Okay. So, I think I've already shown this diagram and these chemical reactions in lab, but just to remember that photosynthesis and cellular respiration are intimately connected. Photosynthesis, the summary reaction is we take carbon dioxide and water and add some light energy. And with that, we can build sugar. Here I have glucose, but there's a variety of sugars that could be produced by photosynthesis. And in the process, release oxygen. Complete glucose breakdown by aerobic cellular respiration would be the exact opposite, except for instead of releasing light energy, that energy comes out in the form of ATP and some heat. So the reactants of one are the products of the other. The products of one are the reactants of the other. So this is a really neat system, and it shows us how the energy within an ecosystem can cycle. No, that's wrong. The energy can flow through an ecosystem. There we go. And the nutrients can cycle, which again is maybe a little more foreshadowing of where we're going with all of this. Okay. So many mistakes. I'm tempted to stop the video, but I probably won't. Okay. All right. And again, just to kind of foreshadow where we're going, we're looking at interactions between organisms, right? So plants like the grasses or the hay, those are photosynthesizing. We would call them autotrophs, or producers is another term that is commonly used. And other organisms have to eat those autotrophs to survive. So like these horses here are heterotrophs, or primary consumers would be another term that we could use. And they are getting energy and nutrients by eating this hay, and they are indirectly getting energy from the sun. Okay, so if we think about what's happening inside the horses themselves, they're breaking down those sugars and some of the cellulose that is in that hay. And they're using that energy to run around and grow and develop and reproduce. But there's another way that energy could be released. If you struck a match and tossed it into a pile of hay, it's going to make a very spectacular fire. And the summary reaction for both, the respiration that's happening in the horses and the hay that is on fire, it's the same chemical reaction. It's the one I just showed you. Glucose is breaking down an oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and water and release a lot of energy. So why don't the horses spontaneously combust? It's the same stuff inside of them, right? Well, the difference is the horses, instead of doing a one big stepwise, one big jump in energy from glucose to carbon dioxide and water, instead, they're slowly breaking the glucose down bit by bit, carbon by carbon, and capturing a lot of that energy in the form of ATP. So, okay, so how does this happen? How does glucose get catabolized? And by catabolism, we mean the breakdown of a big molecule into smaller bits, right? So the first step in the breakdown of glucose happens in the cytoplasm, and it's called glycolysis. And this is where we have glucose that is broken down into pyruvate. So glucose is a 6-carbon molecule, and maybe I'll put some notes on here. Oh, can I read that? No. What color is it? What color is it? Let's try this. 6 carbons. And pyruvate, well, actually, this process forms 2 pyruvates, and each of those has 3 carbons. Okay. Just doing some quick carbon accounting here. So what happens in glycolysis, there actually needs to be a little bit of energy investment. That comes in the form of 2 ATP molecules that are added to glucose, and that allows that glucose to split apart, and then those parts get rearranged into pyruvate. In the process, 4 ATP are produced. So there's a net gain of 2 ATP from glycolysis. So we get a little bit of cellular energy just by the big step in breaking down a 6-carbon sugar into smaller bits. Okay. What happens? Darn. What happens after that? I stopped sharing my screen. Here we go. Sorry about that. All right. And now we need to, I wanted to stop the annotation so I could advance the slide, and they don't make it easy. So that was 6 carbons. And down here we have 2 3-carbon molecules. Okay. Okay. Can I advance the slide this way? No, I can't. I guess that's the thing I need to do. That's what I need to do. Okay. So glycolysis is the first step. And what happens in the next step or steps? Well, it really depends on whether or not oxygen is present. Oxygen really, really likes electrons. So it's a great final electron acceptor for the electrons that were in glucose. So if oxygen is around and cells have the appropriate machinery, the best way to deal with those pyruvates is through aerobic cellular respiration, and this happens in the mitochondria. And this is actually kind of a multi-step process. I've listed them as 2. Some authors might list them as like 4 different things that are happening. There's a lot of things happening at the same time. We don't need to get into all the biochemical details, but I will have some videos that are optional in case you're interested. But, all right, so we need our friend, the mitochondria, our little endosymbiont, the little tiny bacteria that lives in basically every eukaryotic cell, because every eukaryotic cell is going to get more energy from glucose and some other food sources if they can fully metabolize them with oxygen in the mitochondrion. Okay, the first part of this, and if we remember about the mitochondria, there's these double membranes. So there's the outer membrane and this highly folded inner membrane. The inner membrane has a lot of proteins embedded that are part of an electron transport chain. And there's also this great enzyme called ATP synthase, which is what can build a lot of ATP. But before those bits of glucose can get there, they have to go through the citric acid cycle. This is sometimes called the Krebs cycle. But basically what happens, these pyruvates enter the mitochondrion. There's actually a little step before the citric acid cycle where some carbon dioxide comes off. And then That transforms it into this intermediate, which can get fed into the citric acid cycle. That intermediate gets broken down like one carbon at a time, essentially, and a little bit more ATP is formed. Carbon dioxide is released, and I should put on a note about how much carbon dioxide. Oh, I want blue. Blue, can we get blue? Okay, there we go. There's blue. And I'm going to say there are 6 carbon dioxides. Oh. Well, maybe we'll do this way. It's like CO2. So by the end of the citric acid cycle, that go, move it around. By the end of the citric acid cycle, all the carbon is gone. It is taken the form of carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide can just diffuse through the membranes of the mitochondrion and through the plasma membrane, and you can exhale that out of your bloodstream, quite literally. So there's no more carbon left, but there are still some bits of glucose that still contain a lot of energy. Some of that was captured in the ATP that was formed in glycolysis and the citric acid cycle. Other parts of glucose, namely high energy electrons, are shuttled out in one of those electron shuttles, that NAD, and there's a different one called FAD. We don't need to get into all those biochemical details of how that works, but basically they're taking electrons that originally were in glucose and transporting them to this electron transport system. So here where it says high energy electrons and hydrogen ions, those are the H2 part of glucose, which is, or H12 part of glucose. If we think back to the chemical formula of glucose. Okay, so anyway, we've got these high energy electrons. What do we do with those? Well, if we feed them to this electron transport system, it's kind of like a bucket brigade for electrons that is in the inner membrane. As those electrons are moving, they can pump hydrogen ions across the membrane and build up a nice reservoir of potential energy. And that potential energy can drive the synthesis of ATP. And this actually drives the synthesis of a lot of ATP. If glycolysis produces 2 ATP for glucose on a net basis, citric acid cycle, we get another 2 ATP for glucose. The electron transport system would produce something like anywhere, we'll say like 24 to 36 ATP. We'll maybe just call it 30 on average. The number is a rough number. It's not a one-to-one correspondence, and different books say different things. It doesn't matter. The big point here is this electron transport system is very, very efficient for producing ATP, and most of our ATP comes from this oxidative phosphorylation. All right. The only thing to wrap up here is, well, what happens to those electrons? Where do they go? Why do they just keep going through these electron transport chains? They're losing energy as they pump those hydrogen ions across the membrane. And really, we need a good final electron acceptor, something that'll take those electrons and be happy. And this is where our hero oxygen comes in. Oxygen comes in to take the electrons from this electron transport system, these spent low energy electrons. It will take them and pick up some hydrogen ions and form water. And this is a very stable molecule and has much lower energy than oxygen and glucose did at the start. So we start out, well, our reactants for aerobic cellular respiration, if we remember, were glucose and oxygen. Glucose comes in at the start, oxygen kind of comes in at the end. And in the process, we form carbon dioxide and water. So voila, it is done. Great. Okay, so again, I didn't get into all the details. If you want those, there are awesome videos and better explainers than I would do out there, but we don't need that detail. Okay, so what happens if we don't have oxygen? And I'm going to clear these annotations. Nope. Where do we clear those? Oh, there we go. They're all drawings. They changed some things and now I'm all confused. Okay, well, without oxygen, our mitochondria won't be doing anything for us. So we have to use some other pathways. And there are some alternatives, and they turn out to be very necessary, but they aren't as good for in terms of ATP production. So the big problem with these other pathways is glycolysis harvests some high energy electrons from glucose in the form of, really the form is NADH when they pick up the electrons. The shuttle is empty, it's just called NAD+. Again, small biochemical detail. You don't need to remember that. You do need to remember that these shuttles need to get emptied. If all the shuttles are full, there's nothing that can pick up those high energy electrons in glucose, and the entire process shuts down and the cell dies. So that would be bad, right? So we want to at least keep glycolysis going. And one way to keep glycolysis going is through a process called fermentation. So fermentation occurs when oxygen is either low or absent. In other words, what we would call anaerobic conditions. Fermentations happen in the cytoplasm of a cell. And here, the point of this is not to produce ATP. The point is to produce the point is to empty out those electron shuttles so that NADH gets recycled back into NAD+, which can go pick up electrons in glycolysis, and we can keep producing ATP through glycolysis. And there are two types. One of them humans can actually do. This is called lactic acid fermentation. And the other type is called alcoholic fermentation, which our friends the yeast can do, such as in baking bread or brewing beer or wine. So we're going to start with lactic acid fermentation. And if you are ever short of breath, you're exerting yourself so hard that you can't catch your breath, your cells can't get enough oxygen to those mitochondria to fully break down glucose with oxygen, well, what's going to happen is this lactic acid fermentation. Glycolysis happens very, very quickly in the cytoplasm, and it produces a quick burst of ATP. So sprinters are relying on lactic acid fermentation to be able to keep that glycolysis going for that quick energy. But you can't sprint forever, right? Marathon runners, they're doing aerobic cellular respiration. Okay, so what happens in lactic acid fermentation? So glucose gets broken down into 2-pyruvate. Those electron shuttles fill up and some ATP is produced, right? In this lactic acid fermentation, there's a neat little trick. You can actually add those electrons back onto pyruvate and form two molecules of lactic acid or lactate, as it would, the ionic form of lactic acid. Again, a biochemical detail that you don't need to remember. But the beautiful thing here is that we have regenerated that NAD plus, that empty shuttle, which can go be used in glycolysis again. So this process can just keep happening until too much lactic acid builds up or until you run out of glucose. And you'll get lots of quick energy. That lactate needs to be dealt with later on, but that's a problem for the bloodstream and the liver. And maybe your muscles are sore the next day, although the evidence on that is a little mixed, actually, lately. So, okay. What about the other type of fermentation? Oh, actually, before we even get there, I should also mention that humans do lactic acid fermentation. And also some prokaryotes can do lactic acid fermentation. So like the lactobacilli that are in yogurt or sour cream, there are bacteria that are used in cheese making, and especially like Swiss cheese. There's a bacteria that produces lactate, and then there's a different bacteria that actually ferments the lactate into propionate and forms the little holes of carbon dioxide. Again, the biochemistry we don't need to know, but just know that we have taken advantage of this type of fermentation to make some tasty foods that are a little bit sour because of that lactic acid. Okay, and I should also mention here that some other prokaryotes have a really interesting solution called anaerobic cellular respiration. We don't have time to get into the details of that, but it's kind of cool because they involve electron transport chains, but instead of oxygen as the final electron acceptor, they use weird things like, I won't even tell you what they are, but there are some really interesting metabolic variations. So yeah. So and basically these fermentations, the trick with the fermentation is it's using pyruvate as a final electron acceptor, or a derivative of pyruvate as that final electron acceptor. Okay. What about the other type of fermentation, that alcoholic fermentation, the one that the yeast are doing? Well, yeast, if they had their choice, they would rather do aerobic cellular respiration, like 36, 30, 34, 36 ATP per glucose versus 2. It's much more efficient, right? But without oxygen, they can at least keep their metabolism going. They'll need more sugar, but they will be able to survive, right? So, so what happens in that process, the pyruvate, and again, they've called it pyruvic acid here, but either one is equivalent for our purposes. That gets broken down. So pyruvate or pyruvic acid, again, has 3 carbons. And that gets broken down into carbon dioxide and this other chemical. I'm not even going to say the name. I'm just going to tell you it has 2 carbons. And then that 2 carbon molecule is transformed with the help of NADH into ethanol, which is also a 2 carbon molecule. Okay. And we see again that this electron shuttle gets emptied out, so it can go into glycolysis and pick up electrons from glucose, so we can keep the game going. We're not going to score a lot of points in this game if the points are ATP, right? But we can at least keep the game going. All right, so that's alcoholic fermentation. And clear my notes again. Okay, there we go. So here we have some biologists in their natural habitat. This was from a conference several years back where we got a tour of the Hopworks Urban Brewery over in Southeast Portland, and they do a lot of cool stuff there. If you're of age and you are interested in taking a tour, I highly recommend it. You can see their fermentation tanks here. And what's really neat is coming off the top of these fermentation tanks is a hose that goes down into a bucket, and it is bubbling a lot. So this is an airlock. So this keeps the air out of the tanks. So the tanks remain anaerobic, and it lets the carbon dioxide escape so that the tanks don't explode, which is kind of nice. So the CO2 bubbles out, the ethanol builds up, and after a while they stop the fermentation because, well, really the yeast kind of stop it for themselves. There's not enough sugar or too much ethanol, and then they put it into different tanks to kind of condition it and package. So, okay. So beer, wine, bread, these would not happen without fermentation. So I for one, am thankful for yeast. All right. What about nutrients besides glucose? So if you looked carefully at that earlier diagram, there were things like glycerol and amino acids and fatty acids. Well, those are all parts of different macromolecules. Those are parts of fats and proteins, right? And it turns out fats and proteins are also energy-rich organic molecules, and it would be great if we could harvest that energy, especially when glucose is not around. So these molecules, they've got a few extra steps to get them ready. Glycerol can actually feed into some of the stages of glycolysis. Certain amino acids can feed in there. Certain amino acids can be converted to pyruvate. Fatty acids can be converted into the intermediate right before the citric acid cycle. Others can feed directly into the citric acid cycle. I should say other amino acids or parts of amino acids. So this metabolism, this aerobic metabolism, can be used to break down any food source as long as it's got carbons and high energy electrons. Basically, we can probably use it as a food source. Well, maybe not plastics, but certain bacteria can break down plastics, which is really cool. Anyway, alrighty. So, and again, we can get lots of ATP out of these molecules. The one thing I will maybe talk about, those amino acids, before they can get fed into this process, they have to have the nitrogens removed, and that is removed as ammonia, and then your liver turns that into urea, and then you can excrete that. So if you're in a high protein diet, you're probably producing a lot more urea and excreting that. Okay. If you want the big picture of metabolism, this is, well, kind of it. It's actually probably even more complicated than this, but this aerobic cellular sugar respiration story that we've been telling, that is here, right? So that's pretty interesting. It's just a small part of the big picture. The anaerobic sugar respiration, it's not really respiration, it's fermentation, right? That can get converted into lactate and ethanol. But then we also have these fats and fatty acids and different amino acids. There's actually even, we can build nucleic acids using some of these parts and interconvert things. And it's really complicated. There's a lot of different enzymes, a lot of different pathways. We don't need to memorize all these details. If you want to, you can go and take biochemistry. But for our purposes, metabolism is complicated, But at the base of it, it's, we're taking energy sources that are out there in the world and breaking them down so that our cells have the energy they need to do the things that they need to do for the organism to do the things it needs to do. Okay. All right. Well, this leads us to a question. We just consider glucose. That's the only one we're going to really have to remember just a few details about. How is that glucose made? Well, the short answer is photosynthesis. Thank you, plants, wherever you are. Not in here, but yeah. So plants are soaking up the sunlight and the water, and they're using that to make sugars and produce oxygen. And without it, no other types of organisms on Earth could survive. Or to a good approximation. There's some unusual metabolisms out there that can maybe use some geothermal and chemical sources of energy, but they're the exceptions, right? The rule is we're powered by the sun. So yes, thank you, sun. This is the ultimate source of energy for all life on Earth. This is actually a picture I took with one of my telescopes. If you want to look through this telescope, let me know, because it's pretty cool. And the view looks almost like this. If you think about the Earth would be a tiny little dot, maybe about the size of the little laser pointer here. Of course, the Earth is more blue and green and white than red, but yeah, we're puny. The sun is putting out massive amounts of energy, and the plants on our planet, they're capturing a lot of energy, but it's just a tiny fraction of what the sun could produce or does produce. And it's really only a tiny fraction of the energy that hits the Earth. So most of the energy that hits the Earth is not used for photosynthesis. Okay. So, well, where does photosynthesis happen? Here we are talking about leaves, in particular, the mesophyll cells of the leaf, that is the ones in the middle that have chloroplasts. There's little holes in the leaf where oxygen can escape and carbon dioxide can come in. And that carbon dioxide eventually makes its way to the chloroplasts inside of these leaf cells. And in the chloroplasts, there are two different places to talk about. There are the thylakoids. The chloroplast has a double membrane, just like the mitochondria. But then there's a third set of membranes called the thylakoids, and these are stacked up like pancakes. So that's one place. That's actually where the plant pigments are that are going to capture sunlight. And then there's also the stroma, which is kind of the space between the thylakoids, which is where the sugars get built. Okay. I guess a good question now is, do all plant cells have chloroplasts? Short answer is no. So some of the epidermis cells in a leaf don't actually have chloroplasts. Those are just transparent, and they just produce waxy covering to minimize water loss, and also maybe protect against bugs and things like that. But, and if we think about the rest of the plant, the roots are underground. They're not getting light. They don't have chloroplasts. And a lot of the stem doesn't have chloroplasts. Well, surely at least some of the cells in every plant has chloroplasts, right? Turns out there's always an exception in biology. Always an exception. Here's a flowering plant called ghost pipe that lacks chloroplasts because it's a parasite. It is actually a heterotroph. It's putting its roots into the roots of trees that are nearby and sucking out their sugars and feeding itself that way. So I guess it's not feeding itself, it's feeding on something else. But anyway, that's just a short detour. Well, okay. But most plants are green, right? So why are plants green? Um, well, we could say they're green because the chloroplasts are green, right? Well, why are those chloroplasts green? Well, if we look at those thylakoid membranes, they have chlorophyll embedded in them. Chlorophyll is actually a lipid. It is a pigment molecule that embeds itself in the lipid or the phospholipid bilayer of those thylakoids and associates with various proteins and stuff. But it's really chlorophyll. It's absorbing the light and using that energy to power photosynthesis. Okay, we look at the absorbance spectrum of chlorophyll. I'm just going to take this solid line here. It absorbs a lot of blue light. There's kind of this notch in absorbance in the blue, green, and yellow and orange. And then it absorbs some red light. So chlorophyll is absorbing blue and red, and it is either reflecting or transmitting green light. So this kind of ties into our lab activity for photosynthesis. So, okay, well, wait a minute. Wouldn't it be more efficient if plants could capture all the sunlight? Why aren't plants black, right? The short answer is evolution. The evolutionary history of green plants, they were competing with some bacteria that also photosynthesize using different mechanisms, but they had already, taken up the green part of the spectrum. So plants just picked what was available, right? Or the ancestors of plants just used what was available. So that's maybe one answer. The other answer is, well, actually plants can capture other colors of light, just not as well as they can capture red and green. So there are some accessory pigments like carotenoids and xanthophylls and anthocyanins. You don't need to remember those words, but basically these are the ones that turn pretty colors in the fall. The reds and oranges and purples and these accessory pigments, there aren't as many, but they can extend the range of light that plants are able to capture. So those are also, a lot of those are also embedded in the thylakoids of a chloroplast. Okay, so what happens in photosynthesis? Ooh, there's a lot of biochemical detail that, again, we don't really need to get into with this course, but I'll have some optional links if you are interested. The short story is there's two main processes, the light-dependent reactions, where light is captured by these pigments, and then that energy is stored and shuttled to the Calvin cycle, or sometimes called the light-independent reactions, or they used to call these the dark reactions. Realistically, they're not going to happen without light. They're not going to happen without the products of the light-dependent reactions. So everything is light-dependent, but I guess it's, directly dependent or indirectly dependent. So in any case, the Calvin cycle, that's where the sugars get built. So we'll take each of these in turn, talk about them in a little bit more detail. But again, this is not the full picture. And the full picture is kind of brain melting, and I don't even know that I really understand it. So, all right. So these light-dependent reactions, here we're looking at the thylakoids, the thylakoid membranes of the chloroplast, where all the chlorophyll is, right? The chlorophyll can absorb the sunlight energy, and it sends some of its electrons through an electron transport system. The net result of that is the formation of ATP. And then those electrons are also picked up by this other electron carrier called NADPH, or actually, I guess NADP plus is the empty version of this electron shuttle. And then water is split, and oxygen is released. So we formed ATP, we've got some high energy electrons, and we split water and released oxygen. So we have done half of the summary reaction for photosynthesis, basically. Okay, well, what about the other half? That is the Calvin cycle. And the Calvin cycle is happening in the stroma of the chloroplast. And it's taking that ATP and the high energy electrons that have been shuttled over. And it is also combining that with carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to produce sugars. In this diagram, it says Ga3P. Those can get combined to make glucose or fructose, and then those can be combined to make starch or cellulose. There's a lot of different sugar products that could be made. We're going to keep it simple and just say sugar, or if we want to get really complicated, if we want to have a specific sugar, we'll say glucose. But just realize it could be other sugars. Yeah, so that's it. That's photosynthesis. Okay, so again, we didn't get into all the details, and I almost don't want to mention these, but there's some really interesting similarities between photosynthesis and aerobic cellular respiration. Both of these are happening in organelles that are descended from bacteria. So they're both endosymbiotic organelles, which is kind of interesting. They're both performing complex multi-step biochemical pathways. Some of these pathways are cyclic pathways. They both have a lot of internal membranes in these organelles. And these internal membranes contain electron transport systems, which can use high energy electrons that are being shuttled around. The form is slightly different. NADH, NADPH, FADH2. I need to fix this slide really quick. I see an error and it's bugging me. There we go. NADPH, FADH2 is another one that, again, you don't really need to remember that one at all. Yeah, these electrons are shuttled around and used. That energy is used either to produce ATP or to build sugars, right? And these organelles have ways of storing hydrogen ions that get pumped across those membranes in these electron transport systems. And it forms ATP. The process is called chemiosmosis, but again, you can quickly forget that word. It's using that ATP synthase enzyme. And it's the same enzyme in both membranes, actually. So it's really some striking similarities. And this kind of all points back towards this evolutionary history of the development of eukaryotes. So anyway, okay. So a lot of details here, and we only kind of scratched the surface of those biochemical details, but just try and keep the big picture in mind. So photosynthesis, taking carbon dioxide and water, using light energy to build sugar, release oxygen. Glucose, if that gets broken down through glycolysis and aerobic cellular respiration, that's going to form a lot of ATP and produce carbon dioxide and water. And again, we have these nutrients that are cycling between carbon dioxide and glucose and water and oxygen. But then the energy is flowing from sunlight through those plants, through the glucose, and eventually to ATP and to whatever cellular process needs to happen. And thought question for you, do plants need to perform both photosynthesis and aerobic cellular respiration? Generally, yes, unless we're talking about ghost pipe, then it's only aerobic cellular respiration. But most plants are performing both, right? There are times when sunlight isn't available or water isn't available, or carbon dioxide is not available, and they need to rely on aerobic cellular respiration to keep their cells alive. Okay. The last thing I'm going to leave here for you is not a picture of me. Actually, I'm going to stop my video. Stop the video so you can actually read this. I'm not going to read it to you, but this is a good thought about the link between photosynthesis and aerobic cellular respiration. Bye.